Hi, my name is Andrea Noella. Welcome to the Burn Bag podcast. Today, I'm delighted to host General Michael Nagata and Laurel Miller. General Nagata is a retired U.S. Army Lieutenant General. He served at the National Counterterrorism Center and also served as the commander of Special Operations Command Central, a sub-unified command of CENTCOM. Laurel Miller is a former senior State Department official responsible for Afghanistan and Pakistan, and is also the president and CEO of the Asia Foundation. Starting in 2022, both General Nagata and Laurel co-chaired a study group of experts at the U.S. Institute of Peace to assess terrorism risks from Afghanistan and Pakistan and U.S. policy options to respond to those threats. They just recently published this report, which really provides a great threat matrix, a summary of potential policy challenges and solutions, and also some information about these terrorist organizations operating in that South Asia region. So, General Nagata, Laurel, thank you for joining me here, and I'm also joined by my co-host Andrea Ochoa as well. So, thanks all for joining.
Great to be here.
Likewise.
So, the first question, I guess, how in general has the counterterrorism landscape changed since the Afghanistan withdrawal in 2021? Is it as bad as some folks expected it to be? Is it any different from what we expected it to be?
I'll take the first swing at this. Of course, the answer to that question depends on whatever individual's perspective is trying to examine it. Rather predictably, the perspective of those that decided to withdraw in the manner that we did tend to view it through the lens of, at the end of the day, this was the strategically correct thing to do. We have other priorities that we need to address, and we had done enough. Perspective of others, I will put myself in this camp, was that we were making a series of pretty questionable assumptions about the benefits that the United States would derive from the nature of the withdrawal that we ended up implementing. My own view is that of those two camps, the latter camp, I'm a little biased since I'm in this camp, but the latter camp was the more correct one, that we were underestimating the consequences of not just the withdrawal, but also the nature of the withdrawal, the way in which we withdrew. And the aftermath, I would argue, strategically has been at least disappointing. I will go so far personally as saying it has become quite dangerous.
To add to that, maybe look a little bit here at how the policy aspects of the counterterrorism landscape have changed in Washington. What we observed in the study group, and I would say there was pretty close to consensus on this, that the U.S. had probably gone too far in making everything about counterterrorism after 9/11, that it just swamped the policy process, the policy responses, and the agenda in Washington to too great a degree. But what I think we also had consensus on is that there's been an overcorrection, and that that's not only or maybe even primarily driven by a threat assessment. It is to a considerable extent that overcorrection driven by human factors, it's all human factors at the end of the day, but I mean, human, bureaucratic, political, and to a certain extent, even personal factors. The fatigue with counterterrorism, the fatigue with Afghanistan and Pakistan specifically as policy priorities. And so when the withdrawal happened, and there was a long, slow burn to the withdrawal and a long, slow burn to that fatigue, but when it happened, we observed that there was then a kind of overwhelming desire to sweep it all under the rug and to lower. I mean, you see it manifest in what the policy agenda is, but also the very dramatic lowering of the level, by which I mean level of seniority of who even pays attention to these issues and focuses on these issues. No one in our group was advocating for a return to the past, for swinging the pendulum all the way back in the other direction. What we were focused on was, how do you right size this? How do you bring better balance to the policy approach on counterterrorism?
So, Laurel, you mentioned, maybe the policy approach was a little bit too focused on counterterrorism. And this is, I guess, a question for both of you. In your, obviously ideal world, and thinking ideally never works in kind of the spaces that we operate in. But what should that policy approach post 9/11 have included a bit more of? Is this thinking reconstruction or economic development, or in relation to what you both worked on? Where can we see maybe other gaps being filled in addressing counterterrorism?
You mean looking back at the 20 years of focus on this? Where were the imbalances?
Yeah, looking back or even looking forward. I mean, thinking to the findings in your report as well.
Looking back is that's a big topic and pretty complicated. And I think, in my own view, one of the key problems in Afghanistan was the entanglement of counterterrorism and counterinsurgency, and that we got involved in a very large counterinsurgency and nation building endeavor. Not to say that all of that was necessarily wrong. I'm not judging it as all wrong. I'm just saying that intertwining of counterterrorism and counterinsurgency, I think, muddied our policy responses and our policy and our actions in the region. Looking forward, there are a few things that we've recommended for that rebalancing. One is to put more concerted focus on pressuring the Taliban through drawing public and multilateral attention to what is happening in Afghanistan in terms of the space that they are giving to terrorist groups and the threats that are emanating from Afghanistan in ways that are attributable to that space that they are giving to terrorist groups. Working with other countries in the region and more broadly internationally to shine a brighter light on that. That is different than suggesting a greater isolation of the Taliban, and we can talk about that more, but at least drawing greater public attention to it and having a higher level diplomatic effort to shine that light. We also considered Pakistan, obviously, as you have to, in this picture, and the essential nature, whether you like it or not, and many in Washington don't like it, of the imperative of working with Pakistan on counterterrorism, and not only in the military domain, but also in focusing more attention on supporting Pakistan in improving social cohesion and addressing some of the roots of militancy and instability in Pakistan. None of us who were considering these issues regard that as easy to do, but there is something to how much effort you put into issues, whether they're easy to achieve results or not.
Let me chime in with just a couple of things because I can't resist. I agree with everything Laurel just said. I'll just add to it. I'm going to come at this from two directions. One is, at least from my point of view, what I wish the United States had done. And I'm not talking about whether or not we should have withdrawn, but I'm talking about how we withdrew. And then the second one is, what have been the strategic consequences of the choices we made? So on the first one, what I wish had been different is I wish we had decided to leave some kind of presence in Afghanistan. I'm sure there were many proposals over the years about leaving some kind of residual American government, not just military, American government presence to basically encourage the Afghans to do the right things, but also so we would understand what was happening there. Unfortunately, the decision was no, we're just gonna leave. The second one was a consequence of that, and that is we lost our granular understanding of the environment. We no longer understood what was happening on the ground. In some ways, we lost a certain amount of awareness of what was happening in the region because of the nature of our withdrawal. What did that lead to? Enormous reputational damage for the United States. Whether you think that's unfounded or well-founded, I think it is simply a fact that the strategic reputation of the United States was badly damaged by what happened in Afghanistan in ways that I don't think any of our policymakers completely understood. There were certainly people telling policymakers this would be the consequence, but for whatever reason, that advice was ignored. And then the second one was the effect this has had on regional stability. Regional stability has not improved; it has deteriorated for all kinds of reasons, not just because of the way we left from Afghanistan. But this is strategic deterioration in an environment where at least two of the countries in this part of the world are nuclear armed. It's hard for me to imagine where else in the world would we do that, but we did it in South Asia.
Yep, and I mean, I think a lot of folks since the withdrawal of Afghanistan have often, at least the general public, has not been paying attention, perhaps until the Moscow concert hall attacks. I just did an episode with Javed on it, I think, a few days after those dreadful attacks, and that sort of highlighted, oh yeah, ISIS exists. ISIS-K, ISIS-Khorasan exists. They're operating in Afghanistan. And, that sort of leads to my next question. I mean, what's the current landscape of these terror groups operating in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and how does that relate to the threat matrix for the U.S., perhaps an attack on U.S. interests in surrounding areas or an attack on the homeland? Because, I mean, after all, a lot of these groups can say, hey, like, we want to attack and so on. There perhaps is like an intentionality to attack, but then there's also the question of capabilities. I mean, who are these groups that are still sort of in the area, and is an attack possible? Are they capable of launching an attack like they did in Moscow?
I'll take the first swing at it. Unfortunately, there are too many groups. There's the original Al-Qaeda problem, which has not gone away. Unsurprisingly, whatever pledges we thought we were getting from the Taliban that they would sever their relationship with Al-Qaeda, that obviously did not happen. It's not going to happen. But I would argue at the end of the day, I think the best answer to your question that I can give you is that the various extremist movements in this part of the world, ranging from ones that are generally well understood by the American public, which are Al-Qaeda, to a degree, ISIS-K, but there are several others as well, including extremist groups that both Pakistan and India use to attack each other and have done for decades now. I would argue that all of them got two benefits from the nature of our withdrawal. First, they got inspiration from the American withdrawal. It seemed to them to be such a strategic defeat and retreat by the United States that they have been inspired by this. Now, that's not a tangible thing, but inspiration is incredibly powerful. And I think we're already starting to see the consequences of the inspiring energy that extremist elements in this part of the world derive from the U.S. withdrawal. The second one is that aside from being inspired, they believe, and I think they have ample reason to believe, that American credibility in this part of the world has been badly damaged, and that constitutes strategic and operational opportunity for them that they are going to try to seize.
To add to that, ISIS-K is clearly the most worrisome group at present in terms of threats to the U.S. partners, and others. It's also a threat to the Taliban and an implacable foe of the Taliban and would like to overthrow the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. It's no great surprise that the Taliban's success against ISIS-K in Afghanistan is limited. We have to remember ISIS-K gained its foothold in Afghanistan while the US and NATO were still there at a, relatively considerable degree of strength in 2015. And the US never dislodged ISIS-K from Afghanistan. So it's not any great surprise that the Taliban is struggling with that as well. So that's on a worrisome trajectory. I would say the other most important factor here in the threat landscape is the expansion of the TTP threat, the Pakistani Taliban threat to Pakistan. Because Pakistan's stability is in the interest of the US and obviously in the interest of Pakistan and Pakistanis as well. And I think one of the, not surprising to me and others, but maybe surprising to some realities that has emerged is that the Taliban has shown more gratitude and loyalty to TTP than it has to Pakistan. TTP being a sort of cousinly group of the Taliban, despite the support that Pakistan, the safe haven that Pakistan gave to the Afghan Taliban during 20 years of the US war in Afghanistan. Kind of predictable. I mean, the Taliban react to what is a potential threat to themselves and where do they, they're in their own way, rational calculators of risk to themselves and where their loyalty needs to lie.
So we talk a lot about these splinter groups, and I think just, continuing the conversation on threat assessments, on your both perspective, do you believe that right now the US should be like, what is threatening us more, the capabilities of these terrorist groups operating in this landscape or the instability that they have the potential to cause in Pakistan and of course with relations with India as well? Or is it a mix of both? Maybe, it's not one over the other.
I think it's hard to disentangle them. I mean, and it depends on the scenarios that might emerge. If there was an out and out conflict between India and Pakistan sparked by a terrorist incident, that would be huge for the United States. A huge distraction from other priorities on the US agenda. And given the relationship that the U.S. has with India and is prioritizing, but also some of the challenges in that relationship too, and how India reacts or the assumptions that it makes when there are terrorist incidents, that would be very, very complicated and draining for the United States. There's also the question of Central Asia and the way that some of these groups are threatening in Central Asia, which is yet another field of geostrategic competition for the United States. What might pose a direct threat to U.S. interests in the U.S. homeland is a little more difficult. I mean, groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda at least express the continued intent to direct attacks against U.S. interests. The capabilities are a little bit harder to assess, partly for the reason that Mike alluded to of the reduction in our capabilities to be able to see what's going on.
Yeah, I again agree with everything Laurel just said. I really think I want to foot stomp the last thing she said. It probably would be. I would be going too far to say we were completely blind in this part of the world when it came to terrorist and extremist trends. We're not completely blind. We're at least half blind. When I compare, and I did this while I was at the National Counterterrorism Center, even before the withdrawal, when I compared back then and when I try to compare as a civilian now, what we once understood was happening, not just militarily or in the terrorist landscape, what we understood about the politics, what we understood about the beliefs of populations in this part of the world, which was never perfect, but we knew a lot. Compared to now, in the wake of our withdrawal, there's no comparison. We do not, in my judgment, we do not adequately understand what is happening in this region. And I'm not just talking about the terrorist landscape. I'm talking about the politics, the societal trends, et cetera. And that lack of understanding, that lack of comprehension fundamentally disables our ability to anticipate what might happen and to be prepared for it when it does happen. Whether it's a terrorist attack or something else, we will very likely be slow, halting, and inadequate in responding because we're walking back into an arena that once we understood very well, but now we understand much less well.
You know, to be fair to US policymakers, I think what they would say is we can't be everywhere all at once. We can't do everything in the world. And there's a lot going on right now in other parts of the world. And that is true. I mean, and I think that everyone in the study group that we chaired had a realistic appreciation of that context that we're in now. So that's why I said at the outset, like, no one's advocating for going all the way back to where we were, but you do have to have a clear-eyed understanding of what is it you can see and what is it you can't see. And it remains the case that the current US policy in Afghanistan is at its core essentially what it was all throughout the war. Prevent there being a terrorist attack emerging from Afghanistan, prevent Afghanistan from being a safe haven for groups that threaten the United States. It's just now the intent or the hope is that you can do that with extremely minimal effort. And the question is, how minimal can that effort be and maintain that as a plausible policy goal? If it's not realistic at the current level of effort that the U.S. judges it needs to make, then you should change your policy goal. But if that is your policy goal, then you need to rethink exactly how much effort you're putting into this part of the world. But it is true, there is a lot going on elsewhere. And, the senior leaders in Washington, even in the best of times, are not great at paying attention to more than three things.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think, Israel Gaza is certainly dominating the views and the lives of many folks in sort of the DC establishment. But, maybe this perhaps could be like an imperfect analogy, but when I've talked to former administration officials, former national security officials about sort of what's going on in Gaza, for example, folks like Jim Clapper have said that this is going to create more terrorists than before. And from my own studies of it, right? Like, it's not just necessarily the war itself, but it's the famines, the starvation, all of these other sort of soft power factors where people are dramatically losing hope in Gaza, and therefore they want to join these terror groups because they don't see perhaps any other option. They're more prone to being radicalized. And in Afghanistan, right, we're seeing a lot of starving people. We're seeing a lot of famine. And we're just seeing just dire circumstances overall. And that sort of begs the question for me is, I feel like recruitment for some of these terror groups should be like skyrocketing to an extent. Do we have an idea around how these terror groups are sort of recruiting new fighters, new members who are disillusioned with the Taliban-led government, but also, again, as General Nagata, you said, right? Like, they don't see the U.S. as a friend because of that credibility that's been damaged with the population. So do we have an idea about, it's not even necessarily that these terror groups are getting a safe haven in these countries. It's more, or in Afghanistan, sorry, but it's more like that, hey, they may be actually growing and prospering and flourishing.
Well, I'll start with what I think is probably a blinding flash of the obvious to most people that are watching what is happening here. There will be an entire generation of new extremists that emerge out of the chaos that is going on, particularly in the Middle East right now. I mean, not that I would ever want to be one, but if I was an Al-Qaeda or ISIS recruiter, my job has just gotten so much easier. My hunch is that most recruiters don't have to do a lot of recruiting anymore. They have people flocking to them saying, I want to join. I want to become a part of exacting retribution against not just the state of Israel, but all of its allies, the United States, anybody else that I could potentially harm. I want in. I think that is an inevitable consequence of what is happening here. And I don't say that to make the argument that some of the things that either Israel or the United States have chosen to do are all wrong-headed. But I think we're kidding ourselves if we don't think that there will be this next generation of terrorists that emerge because of what is happening here. There absolutely will be. And all you have to do is look at the fact that I think over the last decade, a lot of the analysts in Washington, D.C. have started numbering the generations of terrorists that have emerged. I think recently I was in a conference where somebody said that most analysts agree that the emergence of ISIS was the fourth generation of Islamic terrorism to emerge out of the Middle East since the end of World War II. What's going to happen because of what's happening in Gaza is probably going to be the next generation.
I mean, within South Asia, I think it's correct to say that, even when you look at the ebb and flow of the groups there, none of the ebb is attributable to just petering out recruitment. Their active suppression, other factors, but recruitment never seems to be the challenge for the South Asia group. I, at least in the time that I've been observing this, have not seen that really with any groups at all. And it was true with the Taliban when the U.S. was fighting the Taliban. I mean, never did the U.S. really have very sound estimates of the total numbers, but remarkably, the estimates that existed barely changed from the time that the insurgency arose until the end. Didn't matter how many of them you were killing. So recruitment just doesn't seem to be a big challenge in that part of the world.
And, I sort of have a question when we're talking about generations of sort of Islamic terrorism. General Nagata, you mentioned that war in Gaza right now. And I'm sort of curious about, perhaps how you both sort of see it in a historical lens compared to the 1982 war with Lebanon, the Israeli-Lebanon war, and how, for example, that may have actually bin Laden was going to be radicalized, but how that emboldened recruits to join bin Laden. Perhaps how other sort of interventions in the Middle East have emboldened more terrorists to join these organizations. How do you sort of see this moment when you compare it to 1982 and then sort of following events?
Two responses for you. One is because of how the world has changed technologically, no matter where you are in the world, you can feel like you're present in the horrendous conflict that is now being waged between Hamas and the state of Israel. Geographic proximity no longer matters to whether or not you are either outraged or inspired or both by what is happening. And going back to your previous question, there's going to be a large number of people who say, hey, I want to join the cause. I want retribution. So that's my first answer. The second answer is that the fact that we are now seeing an absolutely predictable but often ignored trend of terrorists and extremist groups starting to use increasingly powerful technology is going to make the ability of nation states to deal with terrorism in the future much more dangerous and much more difficult, because in some ways, terrorist groups, non-state actors, will be able to wield state power or state-like military power because they will have access to not just increasingly powerful technology, but as everyone knows, increasingly powerful technology that is becoming more and more affordable and available to anyone.
I think we'll leave it there. Yeah, trying to projecting what the wave is that's going to come as a result of the current events. That's tough. But I certainly agree with Mike that we have to assume that there are going to be waves that emanate from those current circumstances in the Middle East.
When you speak to more affordable technologies, General Nagata, is this kind of alluding to the shift in national security spaces to focusing on cyberspace and that domain in particular, or is it really, more of a harder power approach?
That is, at least in general terms, the arena that I'm trying to talk about. I'll use probably the most common, most vivid example for most people. The drone wars that are happening in the Middle East specifically right now, although it's certainly not the only place. The fact that the Houthis, a little known, at least for Americans, a little known tribal element who happen to be Shia, so we're generally shunned by a lot of the people in that part of the world. Just a couple of months ago, they launched, fortunately an unsuccessful, but they did launch an unmanned maritime drone weaponized to conduct a naval attack. In other words, they were employing a swimming weaponized robot piloted remotely, and probably had at least some limited form of artificial intelligence on board, as most robots do these days. Now, of course, they're a proxy of Iran, so they get resources, technological assistance from a powerful nation state. But regardless, the fact that this tribal element could employ a swimming weaponized robot that was autonomous is a sign of things to come. And coming back to part of your question it begs the question, are nation state governments keeping pace with this threat? The answer is no.
Yeah, it's unimaginable that AI technologies, readily available, cheap, are not going to be increasingly used by malign actors for information warfare, for recruiting, but potentially also in weaponized forms, or to enable the creation and the deployment of weaponry.
Yeah, this can be a whole separate conversation too, as well. I feel like this topic is very much
with other guests, not me. But I know enough to be scared about it.
At the risk of overextending this, the groups we have been talking about, ISIS-K, the Taliban, etc., they're going to do this too. They already are doing this. So I think the thing that U.S. policymakers, as well as operational actors, are going to have to grapple with is, how do we keep pace with the fact that if we do end up having to grapple with any of these various elements in the future, they're not going to be like they once were. They're going to be much more capable, much more powerful, because they're being enabled by technologies that are available on the open market.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And on the policy side of things, so shifting back to that, when we're thinking about, partnership or collaborative approaches to maybe countering this recruitment and, again, these emerging technologies, what is the U.S. stance on either working or confronting the Taliban in preventing the rise of these groups? What does that look like? I'm sure there are differing opinions across the board, both ideological and political, but from your perspective.
This is more Laurel's area than mine, but I'll be happy to chime in once she's done.
I don't think the U.S. is taking an ideological approach to its interactions with the Taliban at the moment. I think it's more of there is some pragmatic interaction in the sense of meetings that occur on occasion, and those are publicly reported. It's the US has a limited set of policy options vis-a-vis the Taliban. I mean, when I mentioned earlier our study group's proposal to apply more pressure on the Taliban, I emphasized that that's about working with other countries in the region. It's about bringing it more into a public space that makes it harder for other governments to be normalizing, in effect, their relationships with the Taliban. What I didn't suggest was that the US unilaterally has some ability to pressure the Taliban to change its policy approaches, policies when it comes to either counterterrorism or treatment of women or anything else. The US didn't succeed in affecting Taliban policy by fighting them for 20 years and killing a lot of them. So it's definitely not going to succeed in pressuring the Taliban to change policies with the very limited tools at its disposal now. But that doesn't mean you don't have any kind of engagement with them to at least try to affect these things around the edges. And to try to bring to bear pressure from others in the region, their neighbors, who they care about their relationships with their neighbors. When it comes to counterterrorism, I don't see any reality to the US truly cooperating in the sense of intelligence sharing or, parallel or cooperative counterterrorism action. I don't think it's realistic in terms of the capabilities that the two sides would bring to bear, or the relationship or the degree of trust that you would need to have there. I agree with what Mike said earlier, that the Taliban never indicated that they would truly distance themselves from al-Qaeda. What they agreed to do in negotiations with the US before the withdrawal was keep a lid on al-Qaeda. If keeping the leader of al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri, in a house in Kabul was keeping a lid on him, then they did that. And, but they would probably argue that was keeping a lid on him. We were keeping him close to keep an eye on him. And it's not a 100% implausible argument. But just to be clear, that's all they ever said they would do, was keep a lid on it. They never even agreed to call al-Qaeda a terrorist group. As we said earlier, they're giving some safe haven to TTP. They're not going to change that. The US isn't going to affect that calculation. There's no sort of cooperation or pressure that the US unilaterally can bring to bear in that regard. And I don't see whether the US could actually support Taliban actions against ISIS-K. I mean, I don't know, Mike, maybe you have a thought on that. That seems just tough to imagine the practical, even if there was the policy will to do that, to try to imagine what the practical realities would be. That stretches my imagination a bit, but maybe you're more imaginative.
Yeah, that would be an awfully heavy lift, particularly in an election year for the United States. But even if it weren't an election year, it would still be a tall order. I'm dubious we could decide to do that, but you never know. The thing is, if things get bad enough, anything becomes possible. That's a horrible way to craft, either statecraft or strategy, but it's often what it takes, things to go horribly wrong. But coming back to your question, as I said, this is more Laurel's domain than it is mine. But I do find myself occasionally wondering if the United States, if I could wave my magic wand and go back to a time that wasn't all that long ago, where, however imperfectly, the United States had pretty decent relationships with most of the countries in the region. They were at least functional. For example, our relationship with the Central Asian states got significantly stronger because we were having to funnel so much of our supplies and materials through the cooperation of the Central Asian states. We once had a very robust training and military support program in Pakistan. It's all gone now, but we once had a substantial presence there. India always, the relationship between the United States and India has always been difficult, but we were able to get help from the Indians on certain things. how different would things be now if the United States still had those relationships? I would argue they'd be substantially better. It would not perfect. It wouldn't necessarily be solving everything that confronts us, but we'd be in a much better position to deal with threats emerging, particularly terrorism threats emerging from South Asia, if we had somehow maintained those relationships. But instead, it's probably going too far to say we abandoned those relationships, but they became much less important to us. And it's absolutely rational that all of those actors, they saw us care less. And as they saw the United States care less, they came to the natural conclusion, well, then I care less about what's happening. And so it's not impossible for us to restore those relationships, not necessarily to be identical to the way they once were, but at least to be more useful. But that requires time, effort, money, and patience. And right now, all those things are in short supply in the United States government.
Sort of sum this whole conversation up. I feel like, as I like to say, people often say when life gives you lemons, you make lemonade. I feel like we're trying to make manure out of, well, you can sort of sub in the word. But, when we're talking about those relations, though, South Asia, India, the big power of South Asia, right? India had the 26/11 attacks in '08 that I think marked a sea change in how India maybe considers counterterrorism approaches. Of course, Sri Lanka even had the long civil war, which ended in a very controversial and bloody fashion, which may perhaps limit U.S. cooperation with Sri Lanka. But Sri Lanka had an ISIS attack in 2019 that killed about 500 people. Bangladesh has also faced many of these issues. And I mean, I would say, the US-India relationship is on the up and up when it comes to economic ties, great power competition, and so on. But on that counterterrorism angle, what do we see coming out of US-India? Given that India, of course, has its longstanding issues with Pakistan, especially around, the Pakistani these terror groups from Pakistan seeping into India over those borders right now. So what's your take on that?
I have a very limited perspective on this because I didn't have a lot to do with India, even when I was in Pakistan. I occasionally interacted with people in India, but it was rare. So I'm sure Laurel has much more valuable things to say about this than I did. But here's my take. The getting to a place, for the United States to get to a place where it could somehow depend on or leverage or make a partnership with a country like India to deal with the problems we've been talking about here would require an investment in doing so that I'm not sure we're prepared to make. We are certainly willing to invest in India for things like, hey, be more problematic when it comes to dealing with China. I would argue that the results have been mixed there, but it's not impossible to get the Indians to be helpful for our purposes in this part of the world, but there's got to be something in it for them. And I don't think I've ever heard an effective articulation and an implementable articulation in the US government. Maybe I just wasn't in the right meetings, but I don't think I've ever heard an implementable approach for India that would persuade them to be more helpful when it comes to terrorism beyond their natural antagonism towards Pakistani-supported terrorist attacks. But anything beyond that, I think the Indians rationally come to a conversation with us about what's in it for us. And we've never, at least in my view, been able to present a persuasive case on that particular argument.
Yeah, I mean, military to military ties and security cooperation between US and India is certainly growing. I mean, it's a completely different situation now than it was even a decade ago in that domain. And I would anticipate that growing as well. But, as Mike said, being fully aligned in terms of priorities and goals and ways of responding to crises, I think that is still a challenge. I mean, I don't have an insider's view at the moment on what the U.S.-India conversations are on counterterrorism. I'm sure that that is a feature of the conversations. But when it comes to the threats that India, or the threat assessments that India has and its perceived threats that it cares about most, including from Pakistan, I think India has its own views that are not shaped by U.S. assessments and U.S. views. And I don't think the U.S., at least in the past, the U.S. and India haven't been entirely on the same page there. But in a crisis, I don't know, India will do what India wants to do and sees as its own interest. And the relationship with the U.S., I don't think will be a constraining factor on India when it comes to any Indian response to terrorism in the region.
Looking ahead, do you guys believe that counterterrorism policy can be tied to strategic competition priorities? Or is this just a case of, we don't necessarily want hands everywhere, but counterterrorism policy will eventually end up becoming a national focus again?
Yeah, I can be very quick with my answer on this. The answer for me is a resounding yes. The problem is we don't necessarily do what is staring us in the face. And when I say staring us in the face, not just in South Asia, but also in other parts of the world that I used to operate in, when I was trying to foster a stronger relationship between whatever national military I was dealing with and the US military, very frequently, I'm oversimplifying this for the sake of being brief, the response I would typically get from a potential partner in another country was, if you Americans want a stronger relationship with us, help us with our terrorism problem. One place that's particularly vivid, not South Asia, is in Africa, where they have enormous violent extremist problems. I frequently ran into this conversation where I'm trying to broker a stronger relationship, and the response is, then help us with terrorism. But going back to South Asia and the rest of the world, I think that's going to be an increasing formulation that's get presented to us. If you want us to be your partner, America, then help us with our violent extremist problem. The question that is unanswered right now is, are we interested in giving people that kind of help? I don't know the answer to that right now. In multiple places, our actions have been to do very little to nothing.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly the case that any incident of any significance that affects the United States would interfere with the U.S. policy agenda related to strategic competition. So if something like what happened in Moscow, in the attack on the concert hall, happened in the U.S., and I'm not saying that that is likely that could happen. I mean, there are reasons why it was easier for that to happen in Moscow than it would be in the U.S. But if there was an incident like that in the U.S., I mean, that's all we would be talking about. And it would really push a lot of other things off of the agenda. There's what you want your policy and strategy to focus on, and then there's what happens in the world. But that's always the case.
Yeah, absolutely. Laurel, General Nagata, thank you so much for joining me and Andrea here today. Folks, we'll have a link to the USIP report that just came out in the description. There's a lot of good information on it, including some descriptions of some of those terror organizations that we talked about. I would say particularly, look into some of those anti-India, anti-Pakistan terror groups, because I don't think they often get enough coverage in the media as they should. And there's so much other great information there, not just put together by General Nagata and Laurel, but put together by that larger team at USIP. So, folks, thanks for joining me here today.
Thanks for having me.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.